One watchdog organization says the ongoing anti-ICE violence and riots are shockingly well organized and well funded as the Trump administration vows to investigate all funding sources for domestic terrorist groups like Antifa, they say, are behind it all. Joining us now to discuss is the president of the Government Accountability Institute and author of nearly a dozen New York Times bestsellers, Peter Schweizer. Good morning to you, sir. Great to see you as always.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Your organization found nearly a dozen radical groups that have received more than $100 million from an organization called Riot, Inc. Now, that is an insane amount of money. So why isn't more being done to go after these funding sources, especially if it's for a domestic terrorist organization?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, part of the challenge is that they work very hard to obscure the flow of money. So take, for example, violent protests that have been occurring in Georgia called Stop Cop City. This was an attempt, is an attempt to develop a training facility for the police. A lot of radical groups have engaged in violent protests. I mean, they're throwing Molotov cocktails, they're assaulting the police. Several of those organizations are funded, and we know that in one particular instance, a group called the Tides Foundation funded that organization. Members of that organization, members of people involved in the protest, have actually been charged in Georgia with domestic terrorism and RICO, which is racketeering. That's just one example, but you have to trace the money, and oftentimes efforts are made to obscure the flow of money, or money is said to go to one project, but it's actually going to something else because, of course, money is fungible. So what you really need, I think, is federal law enforcement to use their ability to subpoena financial records to really get to the bottom of it. There's only a certain amount of work that we can do using public records and public information.
Right. I was going to say, what has been your methodology thus far in following the money trail?
Yeah, so the easiest way to do it is you look at organizations that are registered nonprofits. These are 501c3 or 501c4 organizations. You receive a tax deduction if you donate to them. Some of these organizations have actually organized violent protests. You can look and see who has donated to those organizations. The organizations release a tax form called a 990. They're released by the IRS. And then grant-giving foundations disclose who they give money to. So that's been our methodology. It's been very straightforward. It's very follow the money. But again, the challenge is that if that money's obscured or if it's hidden, you're not going to find it using this technique. The only way that you can really do it is by having subpoena, which is, of course, what some congressional committees or the federal government law enforcement agencies have.
Couldn't you use IRS?
Yeah, IRS is one prospect. In fact, the Wall Street Journal reporting yesterday that the Trump administration is looking at doing this. This is not unprecedented. It's been done in the past. It's been used in instances where federal authorities were using RICO statutes. Those are the racketeering statutes against organized crime. And the argument here potentially would be the same, and that is RICO law says we not only want the person that's committing the actual crime, in the case of the mafia, beating somebody up, but we want to get to the people who are actually organizing the beating up or are behind the criminal conspiracy. That would be the argument here, that if you are funding an organization that is involved in violent protests, you know they're involved in violent protests, which of course are illegal, you could potentially be subject to criminal indictment under the RICO statute for the same reason. That's why you would want federal law enforcement to be looking at these records.
And I understand you also mentioned you're looking for specific code words and phrases that are frequently used from far left, woke people with that kind of ideology. What are some of the phrases you're seeing, and what are their meanings?
Well, yeah, they don't come out and say we're going to have violent protests. They come out and use statements or phrases like, protesting is not enough. They'll use the word direct action. Now, direct action doesn't say violence, but everybody that uses that term knows what direct action means. It means we're going to engage in a violent act. So these are the words that sometimes organizers use on social media when they're communicating amongst themselves, so that if federal law enforcement looks at it, there's no text that says we're going to go beat up cops. They're not that stupid, but they will use these phrases, these code phrases, as signals to what they plan to do. And you find this oftentimes in these protests. They say, look, we're not going to go there just in protest. We're going to engage in direct action. And people know what that means.
The No King's Day protests this weekend are widely reported to be part of Antifa. So how deep does this go? Because we know many Democratic lawmakers plan to be at these rallies. We know that there is word that this is also being done in conjunction with the government shutdown, and that's why Democrats are keeping the government closed. What have you heard?
Yeah, I think what we need to look for on No King's Day is there collaboration between the more radical groups like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL, or FRSO, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. These are very hardcore left-wing groups. They're involved in very raucous protests. They're not listed as the official sponsors of No Kings, but they certainly are coordinating and collaborating with them. And that is, I think, what we need to be looking for. If you're looking at an organization like the ACLU, which is one of the sponsors, they're not likely to want to necessarily have violent protests, but these hardcore groups want to trigger them. And the challenge is that for a lot of people on the left, they see these violent protests as providing energy and emotion to drive the movement. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of this discussion about our congressional Democrats holding out on the government shutdown because of the violent protests, because the assumption is the protests provide energy and emotion that will drive their political cause. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a dangerous game to play. We don't want, to be promoting violence in the streets because we think somehow it's going to energize our cause.
All right. Thank you so much. The president of the Government Accountability Institute and author of nearly a dozen New York Times bestsellers, Peter Schweizer. Always great to see you, sir. Thanks for your expertise.
Thanks for having me.